Rebecca Nurse homestead and the reproduction of the Salem Village Meeting House. The original meeting house was torn down in 1702, but would have served as the location for many of the events that happened during the Salem witch trials, including Reverend Parris's sermons, depositions, and examinations. Now, a lot of the information we have from that time period does not exist, but luckily for us, a lot of Rebecca's examination papers and trial information is stuff that we can still look at today. So what we plan to do is to go through a lot of these documents and talk about what was happening and explain to you guys what the stuff is written down and the history of behind it.
Our goal today is we're going to cover a lot of Rebecca Nurse's transcripts that are surviving. We're going to talk about some of the things that she was accused of doing through her supposed practice of witchcraft. We're going to talk about some of the myths surrounding why she might have been named as a potential witch. And we're also going to have a reading of her examination by some of our staff. So we're going to cover the transcripts as close as we can in chronological order. Some of them do bounce back and forth quite a bit. We have transcripts that are talking about events that happened really early, but they're technically taken down later. So we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit, but we're going to try to go in order of the things as they occurred to Rebecca in 1692. One really nice account that we're going to start with is actually by David Lawson, who's a minister, former minister of Salem Village. And as the events are starting to unfold, he comes back and visits. And he writes down a lot of really detailed accounts. In fact, some of his accounts are much more detailed than the records themselves. And the nice thing is that he's not just writing about what's happening in court, but he's also talking about what's happening behind closed doors in people's homes. So the first one that we have is David talking about his visit to Thomas and Ann Putnam's home. And Ann Putnam is having these amazing fits that he's describing in great detail. Some of the quotes that she's noted as saying is, good wife nurse, be gone, be gone, be gone. And she's having conversations with Rebecca Nurse. She also mentions and talks about points of scripture. And he notes that sometimes when they read those lines of scripture, that it would calm down her fits. But he talks about this over the course of a few days. And this is all leading up to her arrest warrant that is given up later.
All right, so the next document that we have actually comes from Israel and Elizabeth Porter and a couple of the other neighbors. So Rebecca's been sick. She's been sick for about a week at this point, and their intention to go is to talk to her about the accusations. And they go in to visit her, and she automatically brings up the situation that she's heard about these girls having fits, not knowing at this point that they'd actually been naming her. So she kind of goes on to that and talks about how sad it is. And it's not until they tell her that she's been accused by them that she's sort of in shock about it, because she's been ill and bedridden and can't imagine why she would be named. She even talks about the fact that she was not able to go, and she wishes that she could go visit these girls, because that was typically what they would do in Puritan times. People that were older and more learned would go and pray upon people that were having afflictions. And Rebecca says that she didn't go because she'd been sick, and also because in her past she had experienced some type of fit and was nervous that if she, in her state, went to visit these girls and saw them having fits, that she herself would have fits as well. And what's really important, these neighbors really kept a good document of their conversation with Rebecca. And one of her most famous quotes, she actually says to them that they write down. And she says to them, "What sin hath God found out in me, unrepented of, that he should lay such an affliction upon me in my old age?" Basically, what have I done that now I'm being punished for this? I've never done anything, and why is God punishing me? She doesn't blame the young girl. She's blaming, what is God punishing me about at this time?
So the next document that we have after that is the actual arrest warrant that's sworn out against Rebecca. So this is sworn out on March 23rd. They arrest her. They bring her to Ingersoll Tavern. And then we have Rebecca Nurse's actual examination. And this is a very detailed transcription that's actually written by Samuel Parris. And what's wonderful is that we have some nice audio of our volunteers reading out the examination of Rebecca Nurse. So we're going to play that for you to listen to.
What do you say? Have you seen this woman hurt you?
Yes, she beat me this morning.
Abigail, have you been hurt by this woman?
Yes.
Anne Putnam, in a grievous fit, cried out that she heard her.
Goody nurse, here are two Anne Putnam the child and Abigail Williams complains of your hurting them. What do you say to it?
I can say before my eternal Father, I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency.
Here is never a one in the assembly but desires it. But if you be guilty, pray God discovers you.
Then Henry Kenny rose up to speak.
Goodman Kenny, what do you say?
Then he entered his complaint and further said that since nurse came into the meeting house, he was seized twice with an amazed condition.
Here are not only these, but here is the wife of Mr. Thomas Putnam, who accuseth you by credible information, and that both of tempting her to iniquity and of greatly hurting her.
I am innocent and clear, and have not been able to get out of doors these 8 or 9 days.
Mr. Putnam, give in what you have to say.
Then Mr. Edward Putnam gave in his relate.
Is this true, goody nurse?
I never afflicted no child, never in my life.
You see, these accuse you. Is it true?
No.
Are you an innocent person relating to this witchcraft?
Here Thomas Putnam's wife cried out.
Did you not bring the black man with you? Did you not bid me tempt God and die? How often have you eaten and drunk your own damnation?
What do you say to them?
Oh Lord, help me.
She spread out her hands, and the afflicted were grievously vexed.
Do you not see what a solemn condition these are in? When your hands are loose, the persons are afflicted.
Then Mary Walcott, who often heretofore said she had seen her, but never could say or did say that she either bit or pinched her or hurt her, and also Elizabeth Hubbard, under the like circumstances, both openly accused her of hurting them.
Here are these two grown persons now accuse you. What say you? Do you not see them afflicted persons and hear them accused you?
The Lord knows I have not hurt them. I am an innocent person.
It is very awful to all to see these agonies, and you, an old professor thus charged with contracting with the devil by the effects of it, and yet to see you stand with dry eyes when there are so many wet.
You do not know my heart.
You would do well, if you were guilty, to confess and give glory to God.
I am as clear as the child unborn.
What uncertainty there may be in apparitions I know not, yet this with me strikes hard upon you, that you are at the very present charged with familiar spirits. This is your bodily person they speak to. They say now they see these familiar spirits come to your bodily person. Now what do you say to that?
I have none, sir.
If you have confess and give glory to God, I pray God clear you if you be innocent, and if you are guilty, discover you, and therefore give me an upright answer. Have you any familiarity with these spirits?
No, I have none, but with God alone.
How came you sick? For there is an odd discourse of that in the mouths of many.
I am sick at my stomach.
Have you no wounds?
I have none but old age.
You do know whether you are guilty and have familiarity with the devil. And now, when you are here present to see such a thing as these, testify a black man whispering in your ear and birds about you, what do you say to it?
It is all false, and I am clear.
Possibly you may apprehend you are no witch, but have you not been led aside by temptations that way?
I have not.
What a sad thing it is that a church member, here and now, another of Salem, should thus be accused and charged.
Mrs. Pope fell into a grievous fit and cried out a sad thing sure enough, and then many more fell into lamentable fits.
Tell us, have not you had visible appearances more than what is in common with nature?
I have not, nor never had in my life.
Do you think these suffer voluntarily or involuntarily?
I cannot tell.
That is strange. Everyone can judge.
I must be silent.
They accuse you of hurting them, and if you think it is not unwillingly but by design, you must look upon them as murderers.
I cannot tell what to think of it.
Afterwards, when this was somewhat insisted on, she said, "I do not think so." She did not understand aright what was said.
Well, then give an answer now. Do you think these suffer against their wills or not?
I do not think these suffer against their wills.
Why did you never visit these afflicted persons?
Because I was afraid I should have fits too.
Upon the motion of her body, fits followed upon the complainants, abundantly and very frequently.
Is it not an unaccountable case that when you are examined, these persons are afflicted?
I've got nobody to look to but God.
Again, upon stirring her hands, the afflicted were seized with violent fits of torture.
Do you believe these afflicted persons are bewitched?
I do think they are.
When this witchcraft came upon the stage, there was no suspicion of Tituba, Mr. Parris's Indian woman. She professed much love to that child, Betty Parris. But it was her apparition did the mischief. And why should you not also be guilty, for your apparition doth hurt also?
Would you have me belie myself?
She held her neck on one side, and accordingly so were the afflicted taken. Then, authority requiring it, Samuel Parris read what he had in characters, taken from Mr. Thomas Putnam's wife in her fits.
What do you think of this?
I cannot help it. The devil may appear in my shape.
So the next couple of documents that we have are, again, ones that, as I mentioned, were technically written down later on and attested to, but they're giving a little bit more background about the events leading up to Rebecca's arrest, and also the fits that you hear described during the examination as Reverend Parris is writing down that there are people breaking down into fits in between the dialogue. These are some of the things that were going on behind the scenes. So you have Samuel Parris, Nathaniel Ingersoll, and Thomas Putnam talking about what they witnessed of Ann Putnam Sr., her daughter, Mary Walcott, and Abigail Williams. You also have another deposition by Thomas Putnam and Edward Putnam against Rebecca Nurse. And again, they're going into more detail of what happened to Ann Putnam Jr. They tend to focus a lot on the examination. And then you have a deposition by Elizabeth Hubbard, which again is technically taken later, but she is talking mostly about what's going on during that examination, and you hear references to her. So the next document that we have is taken the day after her examination. So this is March 25th. It's focusing on Ann Putnam Jr. And her uncle Edward is claiming that he sees her having a very intense fit. She is claiming that she is being struck by chains, and he says that it's Rebecca Nurse doing it. He doesn't clearly state whether she claims it's Rebecca Nurse, or we don't know if he's assuming it's Rebecca Nurse because her examination was the day before. He even claims that he sees physical marks on her, bite marks and chain marks, and he's very detailed with what he sees and the things that she's saying. And this is a good example of someone who's not afflicted, not seeing apparitions, but he's claiming that he's seen physical evidence on her body that supports what she is saying in the course of her fits.
And this also brings up an important point too, is that all the times that people talk about the witch trials, they're always talking about the young girls having afflictions and fits. And if those situations, if it just been the fits and those were the only things that were being brought up, it might have been easy to dismiss since a lot of them tended to be younger. But when you have people, important men in the society like Edward Putnam, coming forward with actual proof saying, I saw this happen to my niece, and this is physical evidence, these people coming forward with these documents make it more believable for people. Because early on, when a lot of these children and the younger girls are having fits, it's easy to dismiss because children are prone to things like that. It's when you have all of these adults coming forward and testifying in defense of the victims that really starts to set a lot of it in stone and make it really, stick.
So here's another very interesting document. It's John Tarbell, who is Rebecca Nurse's son-in-law, and her son, Samuel Nurse. They both live very close by. And they decide to go and visit Thomas Putnam's household. So they take it upon themselves to visit the Putnams and ask how exactly Rebecca Nurse's name has come up in the first place. And what's kind of interesting is that they admit that she didn't immediately come up with the name on her own. Ann Putnam Jr. seems to have not known the name of the person that was appearing to her. And then Ann Putnam Sr., her mother, and Mercy Lewis, a servant in the house, kind of start pointing the fingers at one another as far as who offered up the name Rebecca Nurse to her.
So what's interesting about this interaction is they actually go to confront the accusers to find out, how did Rebecca's name really get brought up? And when they come into the household to ask these questions, everyone starts pointing the finger at each other. And when they really talk about it, they find out that Ann Putnam Jr. says that the first afflictions began by she saw someone sitting in her grandmother's chair. It was a pale person, and she did not know the person's name, but she said, I do think I remember where she was sitting in the meeting house. And supposedly her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., as well as their servant, Mercy Lewis, basically start throwing names out to her, and they agree upon Rebecca Nurse. But when they ask which one of the women said Rebecca's name, Mercy Lewis points at Ann Putnam Sr., Ann Putnam Sr. points at Mercy Lewis and says she said it. So we don't actually know who came up with the name or who fed it to Ann Putnam Jr., but once the name is said, she agrees that that was the person sitting in her grandmother's chair causing her afflictions.
Yeah, basically, when it comes to trial in June, she all of a sudden clears up this back and forth of how exactly Rebecca Nurse's came up. So it's hard to say if she was always claiming that this is what happened, that she saw the apparition in her grandmother's chair. But the first we actually hear of it is actually later on in the course of Rebecca's trial, and she seems to be backtracking a little bit. So whether she stuck with this story the whole time or came up with it later to explain this gap, it's hard to say.
And that's the case with a lot of these documents. A lot of what's being said comes about later on, in May and June. And so we don't know exactly when the things actually happened, if they were added on to make things look bad. It's all conjecture at this point, but we're putting it in because they put timelines into it happened on this day. So we're putting it in there just telling you the background of where it came from and why it's being mentioned now and sort of how it falls into this whole timeline about Rebecca's accusation.
So the next couple of documents that I have are from Ann Putnam Sr. And like Catherine mentioned, a lot of times you hear over and over again about girls accusing people of witchcraft, girls accusing people of witchcraft. A lot of the documents that are against Rebecca Nurse are actually from Ann Putnam Sr. And some of them are of her daughter backing her up, saying, yes, I saw this happen to my mother. So one that I have here is, again, kind of referring back to March 24th, but she's talking about being visited by the apparitions of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, and that they tortured her for close to 2 hours. And try to get her to sign the Devil's Book.
Which is interesting. We've had this conversation before, is that, the Puritan lifestyle is very much about you get up, you do your work. So the fact that Ann Putnam says that she was in bed for 2 hours fighting with an apparition and no one in the house seems to notice, but when it comes to trial, they basically turn to Ann Putnam Jr. and say, did you see this happen to your mother? And she goes, yep. But it's never mentioned or brought up by anyone else in the household that for 2 hours her mother was in bed having this affliction, having this fight with a spirit that no one else could see.
One of the accusations that Ann Putnam eventually comes forward later with is that she believes that Rebecca Nurse is actually the cause of the deaths of her nieces and nephews. She believes that she's visited by the images of her 6 nieces and nephews in their winding sheets, and that they have told her that Rebecca Nurse, along with other witches, were responsible for their deaths. So the next document that I have is from another branch of the Putnam family. This is John Putnam Jr. and Hannah Putnam. And they are coming forward with a pretty heart-wrenching story in early April. They believe that Rebecca Nurse has bewitched their young infant daughter and caused her death. She apparently was a very healthy child, and then all of a sudden was having fits, and eventually suffered a really violent death, which you can tell they're very grief-stricken over. What's pretty interesting about this one is that they believe that Rebecca did it along with her sisters Mary Esty and Sarah Cloyce. So Rebecca, Mary Esty, and Sarah Cloyce, for those of you who don't know, were all sisters. All of them had the maiden name Town. And they believe that these Town sisters have tortured and killed their young daughter in retaliation for him making a comment in public saying that their mother was a witch, and that's why the 3 of them were witches. And he believes that in retaliation, they've actually murdered their young child. And in another deposition later, Ann Putnam Sr. also mimics this because she tends to just kind of repeat again everything that everybody else has been saying. So the next document is a council record, and we've got an excerpt here that on April 12th, Rebecca Nurse, among others, is actually getting sent to Boston jail. And we even have some of the jailer's bills that show a record of the people that are there and some of the charges that are being accrued on their behalf, sometimes getting charged for things like blankets, food, and shackles.
Especially in Rebecca Nurse's case, they said that when Rebecca was unshackled, that the girls and the people that were afflicted by her were afflicted more. And so her family had to pay to have shackles made because they didn't have handcuffs that would fit everyone. So they made shackles to fit her to keep her from tormenting the afflicted while she was in jail.
All right. So next we have an examination record of Deliverance Hobbs. And Deliverance Hobbs is another woman that has been accused of witchcraft. She's actually been accused with her daughter Abigail. And she ends up confessing. She's one of the many people who later confess. And in her confession, she lists a lot of the other witches that supposedly she is working with. And among them is Rebecca Nurse.
So the next document that we have is the petition for Rebecca Nurse. Now, at this point, a lot of people are really questioning Rebecca's accusations, like why is she being accused? And so her family gathers a bunch of people, 39 neighbors and family members, to sign a petition of her good character. And so they went around asking people to sign their name to it. Now, we know it happened somewhere between possibly April and May. We don't know if it was ever really entered into court record. We don't know where it actually went, but we do know the names of the people and the fact that they put their name on a list saying that they trusted that Rebecca was not actually a witch. So it's an important document. We don't actually know where it went or if it was used at all during her trials.
And as people can see as they're looking at it, there are quite a few members of the Putnam family that are on it. And to be fair, we don't know specifically sometimes which Putnams these are, just because it says Jonathan Putnam. We don't know that that is the same Jonathan Putnam that actually was on some of the transcripts that we saw earlier. There were a lot of people with the same first and last name. So it's been very difficult to find out exactly which people might have actually signed this document. So the next section of her grand jury and trial that we're going to cover is her physical examination. Now, when people were accused of witchcraft, typically there was a physical examination because they believed that very often there was a spot where the devil would feed off of them and infuse them with their magical powers that they were using to torture all of these people. And we have a record from June 2nd of Rebecca Nurse, among others, being examined. It's a group of women being examined and a group of women examining them. And they notice a very strange mark on Rebecca's body.
So what they would normally do is they would strip them down completely naked and then look for different marks. And on Rebecca, they appear to have found something between her legs. And they're unsure of what it is. It's some kind of growth. And so they mark it down as the possibility of being a witch's mark. And so it's brought to the attention of the magistrates that there is a mark on Rebecca.
They do another exam in the afternoon, and what surprises them even more is that now when they're examining them later in the same day, all of a sudden, this mark that they believed they found seems to be gone. And in its place is just a bit of dry skin. So they think that that is, again, very unusual that it should be there in the morning, but not in the afternoon. So to rebut that, Rebecca Preston and Mary Tarbell, who are both Rebecca's daughters, actually write a deposition and claim that their mother has had infirmities over many years. So it's impossible to say for sure if they're definitely talking about the witch's mark, but it seems to be in reference to them finding a strange mark on Rebecca's body. And Rebecca Nurse herself ends up writing a very eloquent petition to the court, and she is humbly asking for a second exam. She claims that what they have found is natural. She asks for a new group of women to examine her, and she actually mentions a couple of midwives by name that she thinks are very experienced and would be able to clear up the matter and tell the court that whatever it was that they found is actually completely natural and nothing supernatural. She realizes that they have taken it as something that's probably going to be held against her, and she wants to try to refute it. The next documents that we have are a list of the indictments against Rebecca Nurse. There are 4 indictments. They're on behalf of Ann Putnam Jr., who we've been talking about. Also Mary Walcott, who came up during her examination, Abigail Williams, Reverend Parris's niece, and Elizabeth Hubbard. And during the course of her trial, there are depositions taken by some of these individuals. Abigail Williams talks about the events in early March when Rebecca is first named, but she closes out the deposition by talking about a number of murders that Rebecca is being accused of. And these get referenced again in other ones as well. She specifically names a Goodman Harwood or Herod, a Benjamin Porter, Rebecca Shepherd, Faith Shepherd. And Mary Walcott's deposition echoes basically the same people she talks about, Rebecca Shepherd and John Harwood, and also Benjamin Holton, another neighbor who is accused, Rebecca is accused of killing. Jonah Childen also echoes that Rebecca was apparently responsible for killing Goodman Harwood, and she's a slightly more detailed. She actually says that Rebecca pushed him off a cart and caused his death. So this document is of John Putnam Sr. and Rebecca Putnam. These are the parents and parents-in-law of John Fuller and Rebecca Shepherd. Rebecca Shepherd is their daughter. And they are claiming that Rebecca actually had nothing to do with the deaths of these people. So we just said that they were named by a few people to have been killed by Rebecca. But this couple is actually saying that the death was supposedly natural, that it was a very violent, malignant fever, but that they never suspected that it was anything like witchcraft.
So the next document that we have is Sarah Holton versus Rebecca Nurse. Sarah Holton was a close by neighbor, and at some point, they don't necessarily mention when this situation happened. It was a number of years before the witch trials, actually. Sarah Holton kept pigs on her farm, and the pigs had actually escaped, whether it's the fault of Sarah Holton's fence or Rebecca Nurse's fence, and the pigs get into Rebecca Nurse's garden and destroy it. And so Rebecca Nurse, being very upset because your garden is your food supply, marches over to the Holton's house and actually has stern words with Sarah Holton's husband, Benjamin. He's very upset about this. Rebecca Nurse was even claiming at some point to her children to shoot the pigs. So it's a very heated argument. Sarah Holton claims, much later during this witch trial time period, that she believes the death of her husband was because of Rebecca Nurse, because she believes after this situation, Benjamin fell ill with all sorts of kinds of fits, and eventually died as a result of Rebecca Nurse supposedly cursing him over this whole interaction.
Yeah, she describes his illness in kind of some detail, that it happens over the course of the summer. So over the course of a couple months, the fits get worse and worse. He has severe stomach pains and bouts of temporary blindness. And she ends up not being the only person to testify about this. Nathaniel Ingersoll and Hannah Ingersoll claim that they met with Benjamin just a short time before his death, and that the doctor was unable to figure out what was happening with him. So here we have an undiagnosed illness that, in retrospect, they must think was the cause of Rebecca Nurse. And he also mentions that it happened 2 days before the death of Rebecca Shepherd, who, as we just talked about, supposedly also died at the hand of Rebecca Nurse. So that gives a little bit of timeline for us of when these deaths supposedly happened. One of the last documents that we have here is actually Nathaniel Putnam Sr. He, again, is a neighbor of Rebecca, and this, again, is actually on Rebecca's behalf. So Catherine talked a little bit before about the huge petition that her family and friends put together for her on her behalf, but doesn't seem to have been entered into the official court records. But this one definitely was. This is Nathaniel Putnam. And he writes, as far as we can tell, the closest equivalent to a 17th century glowing character reference that you can get, where he talks about her living according to her profession, that she hath brought up a great family of children and educated them in godliness. So he is talking about her Christian character, and that even though he'd heard of her having disagreements with her neighbors, that he never knew of her doing anything like what she has been accused of during the course of this trial.
And a document like this would be extremely important because, again, this is a well thought of man who's putting this down and saying, I really thoroughly believe this. He didn't have to do it. He does it. It actually says he was desired by Francis Nurse, so Rebecca's husband, says to him, could you do this for her? And he does it, and writes this glowing recommendation of her godliness and puts it into the public record.
And you can see, too, by the fact that Francis Nurse asked him to do this, you see over and over again throughout the course of her accusations and the course of her trial that her family, her huge extended family, is all working tirelessly to try to clear her name. And a lot of other people that are accused during the witchcraft hysteria do not have that luxury. Many people had families turn on them once they were named of witchcraft, and her family just never seemed to bat an eye. It probably helped, too, that this is someone with the surname Putnam that's putting his stamp of approval on her as well, where, like we've discussed, the Putnam family and many of them actually were testifying against her.
All right, so with all these documents that we've gone over, we've basically touched upon everything that we have for evidence about Rebecca Nurse being accused, people in favor for her, against her, and this is what we can base our knowledge about her and what was happening. Now, being here all the time, hearing people come in for tours, we get constant barrage of really random theories that people throw at us. And we never really know where they come from. And what's interesting is that one of the number one questions we get is, did the Putnams try to get Rebecca Nurse's land? Is that why they were accusing her? Now, it would be a great theory, except land is never mentioned at all in any of this. And the one key factor of this is women in the 1690s did not hold ties to land. So even if Rebecca had been accused and people were trying to get her land, there was no way for that to happen. The other thing is, Rebecca and Francis didn't even own this property at the time. They were leasing it. So they were on a 20-year lease. They did not own this property. So even if people went after them and were hoping to get land, it never would have happened. But there's never a mention of the Putnams mentioning the land, mentioning wanting it. We're not sure where this theory comes from. Our best guess is the fact that during the witch trials, when they had to pay for their time in jail, they had to pay out of pocket. So families were constantly selling off what we call properties, things that they owned in order to pay the courts. So the property was not physical land. It could be something like any, expensive items they had, furniture, a cow even. They would sell properties to the courts as payment for things that they needed to pay off in jail. So it could be where that whole theory comes in. Rebecca Nurse's family had to pay for the shackles. They might have sold some bit of property to the courts in order to do that. And that's where a lot of these theories might be coming from. But you don't see any mention of this in any of the documents. And it's always one of the number one questions people ask us, like, were the Putnams trying to get her land? And according to all of this, no, there's nothing that says that.
Another popular one, again, that's tied to the Putnams is something that actually comes from the Crucible. A lot of people ask, well, wasn't she a midwife? And isn't that why Ann Putnam Sr. accused her of killing all of her children? Now, Ann Putnam did suffer the loss of a few children. And as we mentioned, she did accuse Rebecca of killing some of her nieces and nephews. But there's never a reference to Rebecca Nurse serving as her midwife, like Arthur Miller claims in The Crucible. And you would think that if they're accusing her of all of these murders, and Ann Putnam Sr. really did think that Rebecca serving as a midwife killed her children, that would probably come out in one of the many, many documents that we have from Ann Putnam Sr., and that's something that never comes up. In fact, there's no record of Rebecca Nurse serving as an official midwife in any capacity.
So thank you for joining us today. We're going to be switching over now to our Q&A. We've been keeping track of some of the questions that have been popping up, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can live for you. So hang tight.